Hello, everyone. My name is Jamille Pinheiro, and I'm the co-director of the Environmental Humanities Research Hub at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, as well as the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, which is part of our Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series. Before we begin, I would like to thank Professor Hanieh for joining us today, as well as my co-organizer, Gianfranco Selgas from UCL for our partnership in bringing these conversations to life. Many thanks as well to Annie Sherrod for her support behind the scenes, and of course to all of you for being here with us. The Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series is dedicated to fostering interdisciplinary and transnational dialogues that advance environmental humanities research in its most expansive and engaged forms. And today's session will draw from Professor Hanieh's new book, Crude Capitalism, which examines the shifting geographies of energy production and investment, tracing the connections between oil and capitalism from the late 1880s to the current climate crisis. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A at the end, so feel free to use the chat if you would like to pose a question. I will now hand over to Gianfranco, who will introduce our guest speaker in more detail. And thank you again for joining us. I look forward to the discussion. Gianfranco, over to you.
Thank you, Jamille. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. So we're very excited to close these terms, Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series, by welcoming Professor Arab Hanieh for his talk, Greening the Gulf, Renewables, Fossil Capitalism, and the East-East Axis of World Energy. Our speaker today is a leading scholar in the political economy of the Middle East, with a focus on the intersections of oil, corporate power, and global markets, as well as on Palestine studies, where he critically analyzes development paradigms and the socioeconomic impact of occupation. I'm just going to say a few words about him. Arab Hanieh is professor of political economy and global development at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, University of Exeter. He's also a research fellow at the Transnational Institute and sits on the board of directors of the Middle East Research and Information Project. Hanieh is the author of 4 books. I'm just going to mention 2. Money Markets and Monarchies, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, which won the 2019 British International Studies Association International Political Economy Group Book Prize. And as Jamille mentioned, his most recent book, Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market, which came out with Verso Books in 2024. I have a copy over here. So very excited to have you, Adam. Welcome to Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gianfranco and Jamille, for inviting me and warmly introducing me. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me see. Is that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, good, great. Yes, thanks again for inviting me to present tonight. I wanted to talk a little bit in my presentation around some of the themes from my book, and begin just by outlining the kind of framework that I utilize in the book, but then turn more specifically to the question of the Gulf states of the Middle East, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and their recent expansion of renewable energy and the ways that we can think about renewable energy and situated in the bigger questions of global capitalism. So the book is, as Gianfranco noted, came out with Verso a few months ago. Within this book, what I try to do is think about oil's place in capitalism in ways that look at or kind of breaks with what I think is a dominant framing of oil in much of the literature, which is to see oil as having some kind of innate social power, divorced from its place in capitalist social relations. So the book tries to kind of think about what it is about capitalism, the various logics of capital that give oil this apparent power. Because at the end of the day, oil is basically just a black sticky goo. It doesn't come with any innate control or over our lives. But if we look at the kind of language often used to describe oil, it being a prize or it being a curse, these kinds of or the word devil's excrement. In the words of the former Venezuelan oil minister, these kinds of terms really seem to give power to oil, divorced from these broader logics of capitalism. So that's one kind of aim of the book. And the secondly, it is to trace this history of oil and the place that oil holds in the world within the longer durée of the development of capitalism, particularly, of course, through the 20th century, the emergence of the United States as the dominant global power around the time of the wake of the Second World War, and then looking more through to the current moment and the relative decline of American power and the emergence of new centers of accumulation in China and East Asia, some of which I'll talk a little bit about tonight. The other thing that I try to do in the book is to make the case that we have to think about oil beyond its state as a underground resource, in other words, the kind of upstream language of oil, to think about rather what oil becomes as it circulates, as it's refined, as it's transported, as it's turned into petrochemicals, plastics, these substances that are so pervasive in our lives, to think about the ways that oil is connected to global finance and the American dollar in particular, these kinds of broader questions of our social existence, which oil has, I think, a very deep and often understated connection to. So thinking about these kinds of the downstream, if you like, of oil and its circulation is another aim. And then finally, which bears a lot on what we're talking tonight, is this question of energy transitions and really, I think, reinforcing the point that others have made, that energy transitions under capitalism do not generally involve the substitution of energy sources by one fuel by another, but rather are additive. They involve the overall increase in the total quantity of energy consumed, the overall increase in energy throughput, again connected to the logic of kind of endless accumulation under capitalism. And what this means is that energy tends to grow. And in this case, when we're thinking about renewable energy, it tends to be added on to this kind of fossil substrate. And I think that's very clearly what the case is today. So this language of green transition is, in my opinion, a myth, not in the sense that we are not seeing renewables rolled out, but rather they are not replacing or dismantling fossil capitalism more broadly. So that's kind of the broader perspective. I'm happy to speak in more detail about some of these themes if there are any questions about that. But to speak more, to turn more directly to the question at hand, which is the place of the Gulf Cooperation Council states. You can see these countries, in particular, Saudi Arabia is the major country at hand, as well as the UAE, as I'll come to. These 6 states are all monarchies. They are all major producers of oil and gas, natural gas, particularly in the form of LNG. They are the largest collectively exporters of oil and gas today. And they played a critical role in what's described as the coal to oil transition that took place in the 20th century. In other words, oil's emergence as the principal fossil fuel. The Middle East oil supplies, in particular the Gulf's oil supplies, were really important to this transition because it enabled Europe in particular, Western Europe, to shift from coal to oil under the domination of the big Western oil firms, the so-called Seven Sisters, through that period in the post-war period of the mid-20th century. Another critical feature of these 6 states, I mentioned they're all monarchies, is that they are also have a very distinctive labor structure, in the sense that the majority of the labor force in all of these Gulf states are made up of temporary migrant workers. More than 50% of the workforce in each of these states is made up of non-citizens drawn from all around the world, but particularly South Asia in recent times. These workers are involved in construction industry, retail, the oil industry as well, but they have played a major role in how these societies have developed. In particular, we note at various moments of crisis that these what the Gulf states have tended to do in response to either moments of economic crisis or political crisis is simply deport these workers home. So this kind of distinctive class structure that we see in the Gulf, obviously, I'm not saying all states to some degree rely on kind of this temporary, precarious migrant work, but nowhere to such an extent as the Gulf states. So what we have seen in recent years, basically the last 2 decades, is that there's been an important shift in how these states fit into the broader global oil industry. I mentioned in the middle of the 20th century, the extraction of oil, as with other parts of the world, was largely dominated by big Western vertically integrated oil firms that we are all familiar with today. However, following the nationalization of oil in these states and more widely, there has been a shift in which these the nationally owned oil companies, in particular, I'll highlight Saudi Aramco, the world's biggest oil company, have followed in the footsteps, if you like, of the Western super majors, in the sense that they have also become vertically integrated. They've become active at all parts of the oil value chain, including refining, including petrochemicals, including plastics. And this is a recent and I think significant phenomena, and it is connected to an eastward shift in the Gulf's oil supplies. No longer do these states export predominantly to Western Europe or to the US. Now, the majority of the exports of these states, oil and gas, flow eastward to China and East Asia. So the emergence of this kind of what I call the East-East hydrocarbon axis is, I think, a significant development, and it also helps us to understand why these national oil companies have grown so substantially in size, but also how they are now active at in the renewable sectors as well. So to just go into a little bit more detail around these global trends, if we look at the last 20 years, it's very clear that there has been this major shift in the direction of the global oil trade. This table, I think, is very striking. You can see in the year 2000, about 50% of the world's oil imports went to the US and Europe. Today, we are talking about a fifth going to China, and if we include South Korea, Japan, and other East Asian states, it comes to about a third of the world's oil trade now flowing eastward. Now, this hasn't been a zero-sum game. It's not as if Oil used to go to Western Europe and the US, and the same quantity is now just going east. Rather, there's been an overall absolute increase in fossil fuel production over this period, clearly connected to China's emergence as a center of global manufacturing, as a center of global accumulation. So there's been an absolute increase in the volume of oil consumption, an eastward shift where China, even though it itself an important oil producer, ranking about 7th in the world, now consumes the bulk of the world's oil trade. Now, and this quantity, this new increase is about equivalent to a new US entering the world market. So it's very substantial. Now, the majority of China's oil imports are coming from the Middle East, in particular the GCC states, as well as Iran, and some other smaller imports from elsewhere. So it has really enabled, in this way, China's rise has been very much connected to this eastward shift. And it has, as I said, kind of fed this downstream diversification of the Gulf national oil companies, in particular, what is today the world's biggest oil company, Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco is a state-owned oil company. Part of it is listed on the Saudi stock market, but it's run essentially by the Saudi state. Its profits in 2024 exceeded the combined profits of the five big Western oil super majors. In other words, ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell, and Total Energies. If you add up their profits, Aramco's profits in 2024 exceeded the combined total of those big five companies. So we can see this is a massive oil company. It's the largest oil producer, it's the largest oil exporter, and increasingly, it has also become very much involved in other parts of the oil value chain. So if we think about the petrochemical industry, for example, a major sector of the oil industry, and in fact, oil companies highlight petrochemicals as being basically the future of oil. They see with a decline in the proportion of oil going to liquid transport fuels, that petrochemicals and the demands for plastics and other kinds of petrochemical products will guarantee, if you like, the future of oil. And they explicitly describe it, the big oil companies, in this kind of way. So if we look at petrochemical the industry today, we can see, for example, the kind of cutting edge technologies that aim at converting oil directly into chemicals, the refinery complexes that do this, such as the crude oil to chemicals technology. This is largely being developed in the Gulf as well as China. And in fact, the world's biggest COTC complex is currently expected to launch this year in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco is now the world's second biggest producer of synthetic rubber, a very important oil derivative. It's the third or fourth largest producer of ethylene, a major kind of petrochemical product that basically forms the inputs into all of the kinds of materials that surround us today, synthetic fibers, plastics, rubbers, and so forth. And so we can really see, if you like, the kind of downstream development of these national oil companies. Now, simultaneously, however, which I think is, really an interesting and, if you like, maybe at first glance, a somewhat puzzling development, is the way in which these national oil companies and the Gulf states more generally have embraced the renewables sector. So if we look at renewables more broadly, we can see the prominent place of the Gulf in the so-called green transition. I think this second bullet point you'll see on the slide is, to me, extremely striking, that more than half of the Middle East's total solar and wind capacity is now located in the Gulf states, in the GCC, up from just 18% in 2018. So the Gulf, a recent Financial Times, the Middle East, as a recent Financial Times article put it, is the fastest growing area of the world in renewables capacity outside of China. So it's starting from a low base, which is, partly explains the rapid growth. But this is an industry that is growing substantially in the region and is being led predominantly by the GCC states, in particular Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both of which have added large quantities of mainly solar, but also wind capacity. Really, over the last 5 years, it's that recent kind of these developments. So the question that is often raised when you talk about this, of course, is why? Why are they doing this? In the context of being the largest exporters of crude oil and gas globally. And the answer is, I think, was succinctly provided actually by the Saudi oil minister a couple of years ago, when he spoke about the triple win that's involved in this expansion of renewables in the Gulf. And what he meant by this is that there were three aspects to why the Saudi government thinks in this way around renewables. Firstly, it is the fact that the Gulf states are major global consumers of energy, and particularly of electricity. Saudi Arabia is the 10th largest energy consumer in the world, and measured per capita, 5 of the top energy consumers are located in the Gulf. Now, at the moment, the majority and the vast majority of the Gulf's electricity is produced using fossil fuels, in particular gas, but also oil, as the kind of main fuel for generation of electricity. Now, according to the Saudi oil minister, he saw the substitution or the ramping up of renewables as a way of cheapening the cost of electricity production. So that's the first win, cheapening the cost of electricity. The second win is, of course, that these states can say we are meeting our climate targets. They could stand on the world stage and say we are greening our economies, our industries, our electricity production, and so forth. And that is clearly what they are doing. As part of what Natalie Koch has described as a green nationalism, if you like, where the green credentials wielded by these states are also used as a means of reinforcing authoritarian rule in the GCC. So the second question, the second win, is this question of meeting green targets. And then the third, and this to my mind is the most important, is the fact that these states see freeing up of oil and gas to increase their fossil fuel exports. So because of their heavy reliance upon fossil fuels for electricity production, they see the substitution or rolling out of renewables as a way of increasing the exports of oil and gas. So it's about growing the fossil economy, not shrinking it. And this is very explicitly stated by the Gulf rulers. And in fact, another quote from the Saudi oil minister is, every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. So their orientation is very clear about continuing to grow into sectors like petrochemicals as well as part of this. The other side to this, alongside solar and wind, the picture in this is of a solar farm in the UAE, which is actually the largest single-site solar farm in the world. But also we see the development of other kinds of technologies like batteries. The current, I think, the Chinese EV firm BYD is currently building in Saudi Arabia what will be the world's largest battery site. Also, carbon capture and storage, a very kind of, in my opinion, false approach to dealing with the climate crisis is also heavily promoted by these states and their national oil companies. And another false solution, that of hydrogen, in particular blue hydrogen, produced with natural gas, is also really been earmarked for expansion in the Gulf states. And I can talk to that perhaps in discussion a bit of why that might be the case. So we see in all of these kinds of technologies and solar and wind more generally, the expansion, but not in a contradiction, but in actually in increasing and reinforcing this kind of fossil trajectory. Just very quickly, here are some of the targets that have been outlined by these governments for net zero, renewable energies, and their current solar and wind capacity compared to 2018. And you can see the very dramatic increase. UAE, more than tenfold, etc. Saudi Arabia, even greater. Qatar in a very significant way, in particular with solar. So this is an example of why it is that now more than half the Middle East's renewable capacity is located in the GCC states. Now, just to drill a little bit more into the characteristics of this industry, it is really interesting to look at the projects that are underway in the Gulf, in particular in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And we see in these places a very close tie to the oil industry. In other words, it's national oil companies that are developing these kinds of technologies, while at the same time also expanding the oil and gas production. So you can see like Aramco, you can see the Kuwait National Oil Company, the Qatar Energy now, involved in rolling out these projects. However, there's two companies in particular that are very significant in the whole of the GCC and also the wider Middle East. That is Aqua Power, which is a Saudi firm, partly owned by the Saudi Public Investment Fund, so it's close ties to the kind of oil economy more generally, as well as large private business conglomerates in Saudi Arabia. And Masdar, which is a UAE company, which is chaired, it's partly owned by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and it's chaired by Sultan Al Jaber, who is the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and also, of course, presided over the COP28 summit in Dubai. So we see this interlacing, if you like, of the ownership of renewable projects with the oil industry, very much in evidence. As I mentioned, through the Middle East more broadly, if you look at Jordan, Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco, key centers of kind of expansion of renewables. We see both Aquapower and Masdar in very prominent places, leading the largest renewable projects in those states. So this is not simply a Gulf-based or Gulf isolated phenomena. It's more generally a regional phenomena across the regional scale. The other thing that's very striking about these renewable projects is the heavy involvement, again, of China and East Asian companies. Jinko Solar, for example, the world's biggest solar panel producer, owns a number of or is in consortiums in a number of these renewable projects in the Gulf. Similarly, there are Korean and Japanese energy companies involved. So in other words, this kind of East-East hydrocarbon access is also evident in the renewables space as well. And finally, and very importantly, we need to consider the place of migrant labor in all of this, and the fact that the construction of solar panels and these kinds of cells is significantly cheaper in the Gulf because of the kind of precarious migrant labor structure that I described earlier. Significantly cheaper than other parts of the world because workers are simply paid much less. So that is an important part of understanding what has enabled the expansion of these kinds of energy sources. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up quickly. The final couple of slides. I mentioned, and I'm sure this is not new to many people in this talk, that the question of the expansion of or seeing energy transitions as being additive. It's very clear from this slide or this graph that 1950s is where we see this oil transition take place, massive increase in oil becoming the principal fossil fuel, surpassing coal and surpassing gas. However, that doesn't mean at an absolute level that those fossil fuels were reduced. In fact, last year was the world's largest consumption of oil, gas, and coal. They haven't gone anywhere, these fuels. Oil has been added on top of it. And I think it's very clear, and the Gulf indicates this very sharply, is that the renewables and the shift into renewables is itself also additive in this kind of respect, adding on to the fossil economy. The kinds of patterns I've described, I think, also bear in terms of understanding the geopolitics of the Middle East, the significance of particularly the Gulf as major oil exporters, their deepening ties with China and wider East Asia, I think go a long way to explain the politics of the current moment, in particular the US unstinting support for Israel in the war in Gaza. And I think the kind of attempt by the United States under both Biden and Trump to push a normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel is very clear, situated within this wider context where the US is trying to reassert its primacy through its major allies in historic allies in the Middle East region. It's also, I think, very clear that the kinds of patterns I've described about the national oil companies go a long way to explain the ways in which the Gulf states have taken a very prominent role in climate policy making. The COP summits are very clear evidence of this, but also the plastics treaty that was supposed to have been signed in Busan in South Korea last year. It failed, and the reason that this wasn't signed was largely due to the votes of Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco's efforts in blocking the plastics treaty. So another kind of evidence, if you like, of how they've become concerned with this downstream, the structure of the industry in its downstream sectors as well. So I'll leave it there. I just want to say, if you are interested in the book, the Verso has given me a discount code. You can order up until the end of May with the discount code of Crude through Verso Books. But thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion and any kind of questions you might have. Thanks again. I'll stop the sharing.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was so timely and relevant. And I'm looking forward to hearing questions from everyone. But just to kick off the conversation, I would go back to one of the main takeaways for me, which is like the idea of renewable energy investments as additive, not a replacement, but also serving as a form of greenwashing, which becomes quite visible in summits like COP. So this idea that, and the so-called energy transition is actually masking the continued entrenchment of fossil capitalism, as you said, growing the fossil economy, not shrinking it, right? But now under this guise of diversification. And you refer to that, to how certain solutions are promoted, such as blue hydrogen or carbon capture, biofuels, how they are actually false solutions. And then we wonder actually whose interests these false solutions primarily serve. So you spoke about all of that very eloquently. And then I was wondering more specifically, thinking about all of that context, what your expectations are for the next COP summit, and what is specific about this one compared to previous COP summits, and what do you expect in terms of, the mechanisms and strategies through which Gulf states and their national oil companies will continue to exert influence on global climate policy. And how do you see this obstructing effective action to limit fossil fuel production? And again, thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you. Do you want me to answer those questions now, or wait for further questions?
As you prefer. Would you like to, maybe Gianfranco, would you like to add a question so that Adam can continue to respond?
Yeah, I could do that. I mean, I think you had two really good questions, and then we have one in the chat. But yeah, definitely. Just to put it simple, thank you, Adam. I really appreciate it. So I've been reading the book. I haven't finished it yet, but I wonder if you could give us a short description of the NOCs and the national companies. Thinking about, of course, the case in the 20th century of Latin American companies like PDVSA in Venezuela or Mexico, and how these are different. I guess we can just talk about that a bit, compared with the NOCs in the Middle East in relation to the geopolitical context today, right? With Trump, with everything that is happening. But I'll just leave it there. I know we have another question, and I don't want to take up much of the time. I have other questions I can ask later if we still have time.
Okay, brilliant. So let me try and deal with some of this stuff. And maybe I'll begin with the question in the chat about from Leah about how investment in renewable energy is tied to an increased export of oil. So essentially, what we can see, that graph that that table I showed about, what I spoke about, the very high levels of electricity production and consumption in the Gulf. This is going to increase these levels of electricity production partly because of what I've described in terms of the development of petrochemical industries and other kind of refining projects, etc. So what this means is that this, in the face of growing demand for electricity, and with most of this electricity, like 99% of the electricity being produced through fossil fuels, oil and gas. The goal is to bring renewable energy into this to free up allow more to be exported rather than burnt at home. That's the basic logic. That is how it's connected it frees up a greater volume, if you like, rather than burning it domestically. On Jamille's questions, I think the place of these national oil companies in the climate policy is distinctive in some ways than the privately owned, privately controlled Western companies that we're all familiar with, like ExxonMobil and Chevron and so forth. I mean this in the sense that not that they have a different attitude towards climate or towards dealing with the greenwashing, all of that kind of thing. But what is different about these national oil companies is that because of their connection to the state, they are actually at the table when policy is developed and voted on. And we saw this very clearly at Busan in South Korea, the plastics treaty I mentioned. ExxonMobil and Saudi Aramco had the same line about this plastics treaty. And what they said was that the problem with plastics is not production, it's pollution. That was their slogan. In other words, they didn't want it to be linked to fossil fuel production. They had the same line on this thing. They wanted, dealing with the better recycling, et cetera, which doesn't work. Now, what but Saudi Aramco actually is there when that treaty is voted on, and they have the power to be able to block the treaty going forward. So I think this is an important distinction in terms of thinking about climate strategy today. Is the outsized role of these national oil companies in actually shaping this. Another very good example, by the way, is the question of carbon offsets, which again is one of the major kind of greenwashing techniques that are being rolled out by a whole range of industries, including oil companies. Globally, it involves basically protecting forests and then equating that to a certain amount of carbon credits that can then be accounted on the ledger of carbon production, basically allowing you to produce more. This is a completely false, if you like, and very, I think, extremely destructive industry, in this carbon offsetting industry. But if you look at COP29, the one that just recently passed, where there was the carbon offsetting agreement that was adopted at COP29, that agreement was essentially drafted by the Saudi government. The Saudi government chaired the UN committee that drafted the policy that was eventually adopted at COP29. And the person who chaired for Saudi Arabia, this UN committee, was a former employee of Saudi Aramco. So they very much see, they're very much in the room when these things are being written. I'm not obviously trying to say that Western companies don't have. I mean, obviously they play a major role in lobbying and have a lot of money and all that. But I think there is that distinction that's important to kind of to think about. So in terms of Gianfranco's question about, I think the national oil companies in the Gulf. I think this question that I referred to around the class structures of these countries is quite important to think about when we're looking at Latin America in comparison to the Gulf, in the sense that the the high level of, half of the labor force being these temporary migrant workers who can basically be sent home. There's no labor rights in the sense unions are not allowed. Anyone who goes on strike, and there are strikes, and anyone who protests can simply be legally deported home. That kind of class structure is obviously very different from Latin America, where states and oil companies have to deal with kind of much deeper social contention, if you like. So I think this is something that is quite important, thinking about these regional differences. I do think, however, in terms of the COP that's due in Brazil, it seems to me that a lot of the kinds of discussions that are, or what the Brazilian government is doing, and following the reports around deforestation and the ramping up of fossil fuel production, etc., that I don't think it's going to be in any different from these earlier COPs that we've seen in Baku and Dubai and Cairo over the recent years, in terms of its greenwashing, character.
Yes. So thank you very much, Adam. There is a question from Abir in the chat, and Sean would like to ask one as well. Perhaps we could start by Abir's, and then moving on to Sean, and then Per has a question too. I hope we have time to cover everyone's. So Adam, I think you can read the question in the chat. It has to do with the materiality of oil and the shaping of power dynamics, right?
Shall I take the other two questions as well?
Yes, absolutely. So Sean would like to share your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. This is wonderful. I read your book on Gulf monarchies, so this is a nice introduction to this more recent study. So I'm wondering, I suppose, if you've seen how tourism has in any way intersected with, say, the growth of the renewable energy sector. So my interest is sort of in tourism development, mostly in Oman and a little bit in Saudi Arabia, but I've been quite struck, especially in Saudi Arabia, where there's this sort of very top-down approach to tourism development, by the espousal of the language of sustainability, of sort of ecological conscientiousness, and really just curious if that's something that you've interacted with at all, or if there's ever been any sort of linkage with the development of wind and solar, for instance.
Yes, and perhaps we could hear from Per. Per, would you like to share your question too?
Yes, hello, thank you so much, Adam. That was a very, very inspiring talk. I will for sure read your book too. But I have two questions for you. First is about, I was intrigued by the claim that Saudi Aramco aims to have 40% petrochemicals in the revenues or profits on the long term. But I wonder about the time perspective here. What do they say about the time perspective? When do they aim to reach that tremendously high level? And secondly, I wonder how you would integrate the traditional cartel policies of the OPEC into your analysis. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much for those questions. Maybe I'll begin with Abir's question. Yeah, I mean, on this question of materiality of oil, and I mean, I do think there is people like, if I'm reading the question correctly, people like Tim Mitchell, his work in Carbon Democracy have made the point that, one of the reasons that coal, at least from the perspective of Western governments in the United States and Western Europe in the middle of the 20th century. Oil's ability to kind of be located outside of militant coal miners and located overseas, somewhat distant. It was a way in which they could defang, if you like, the militancy of coal miners in the early 20th century. I think there's aspects of that which is clearly related to the materiality of oil that are very true. Although I do think that if we look at later, that so much of the kind of movements in the Middle East and in Latin America, in Venezuela and elsewhere, in Mexico, around nationalization of oil, the strikes by refinery workers in Iran, all of this kind of militancy connected to both nationalism, anti-colonialism, as well as the left, were a big part of how anti-colonialism was articulated. So I don't, that I think needs to be introduced or thought about in relation to this question of materiality, that just because it's out of travels through pipelines doesn't mean that it can't be the object of class struggle, if you like. So I think if that's if I'm understanding the question correctly, Abir, that's how I would address that. In more broadly, a question around how to deal with something like Aramco. I think part of it is realizing that these national oil companies are on the same page as the Western super majors in terms of how they approach all of these questions. I think their visibility, though, needs to be raised much more in the climate movement, because they do tend, I think, to be either seen as being something over there and not important, in the same kind of way that BP might be important or Shell might be important to us in the UK, for instance. Or I think there is a problem in some of the climate discourse where, in the case of Brazil, for example, this kind of development, fossil fuel-based development, is actually held up as being some kind of, I won't say anti-imperialist, but like progressive form of development as well. Whereas I think they're very clearly on the same page in terms of their attitudes and discourses towards the climate emergency. They may have different roles and play different functions, but again, it does raise this question of how to deal strategically with those kinds of firms. As well as obviously how to deal with the historic debt of colonialism and oil energy debt of energy consumption that we can see globally as well. Historically. Sean, that's a very interesting question. It's something that I haven't actually thought about in a lot of ways, but I think there's certainly this connection with the tourism industry. I think is I'm pretty sure you'll find it there if you dig a bit deeper. The one example that came to my mind was the World Cup in Qatar, which was in. Now I've forgotten when it was, several years ago, just before COVID, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, it was very clear in that World Cup that Qatar actually used offsets, and they claimed to be climate neutral in that World Cup, which they were eventually, several years later. I think the Swiss courts actually found them guilty of lying, basically, just recently around that decision, partly to do with the use of offsets as a way of claiming climate neutrality or carbon neutrality. So, I think that's one example. The Saudi example, you're certainly right. There's these massive marketing of the country, Saudi Arabia, as a tourist destination, often connected again with sporting events like golf and the Grand Prix and these kinds of things. So I think definitely it would be a really fruitful avenue for research, trying to think about the ways in which this green thing is maybe this is the fourth part of the triple win, is actually, in the way it enables the marketing of these countries as destinations for tourism. And And so in terms specifically around the petrochemical stuff, if I'm not mistaken, it's 2050. They're looking at this, if I'm not mistaken. But it's very, I mean, Aramco is really leading the world in this kind of technology, this direct crude oil to chemicals conversion stuff. And they've strategically gone, like there was another Saudi-owned firm, government-owned firm called SABIC, the Saudi Arabia Basic Industries Corporation, which was, I think, ranked number 3 or something in the world in terms of petrochemical firms for a long, in recent years. Recently, Aramco basically bought SABIC, brought it under Aramco. So they've strategically gone looking for these targets to acquire and merge with that will give them access to the downstream sectors like petrochemicals and plastics. So the rubber example I mentioned, the synthetic rubber, they're now the second biggest producer of synthetic rubber in the world, after a Chinese NOC, actually. Sinopec is the biggest. And they got that through acquiring a Dutch-based firm, or a Dutch-owned firm, a year ago or 2 years ago or something. So that's how they kind of got that status as being a major synthetic rubber producer. So on the questions of OPEC, I mean, I think when we're thinking, I mean, obviously it's very important what OPEC does in terms of its production announcements. I think it's interesting in the last announcement last week, or I think it was, they're now talking about basically going after more market share rather than keeping prices high. And I think this is perhaps Saudi Arabia thinking about this being worried about losing market share. And this is a way, I think, of pushing out some of the more expensive producers like shale in the United States if prices do drop. And clearly, in the event of kind of a global recession, which seems that we're heading into in some form, oil consumption does tend to drop anyway. So maybe it's a repeat of the early 1980s, which is what kind of thing that happened in the early 1980s, where the price, and with the price of oil, or the consumption of oil dropping very significantly with the 82 recession, and then the price of oil dropping in 85 very dramatically, and with a whole lot of geopolitical consequences. So maybe that's a similar kind of moment that we're living. But I do think the thing that is different from that earlier time, the 80s, is that the pricing of oil happens in different ways today. It's not set administratively by the big Western oil companies or by OPEC. It's set basically through financial markets and financial flows into US financial markets in WTI and Brent. And yes, it's true that OPEC signaling might affect those financial flows, but it's not a direct one-to-one correspondence. So there's multiple other factors that might affect how those financial markets operate today. So that differencing in oil pricing, I think, is a really important factor of thinking about OPEC's place today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And then we have time for one last question from Professor Kaverzani, if he would like to open his microphone. Yes. Thank you.
Hi, Adam. Thank you very much for the talk. I want to ask you to kind of like step a little bit outside this topic that you covered so in a fascinating way. And, the Gulf is divided, in the north, there's obviously Iran and Iraq, which have very different social dynamics. And this is a question that's really concerned me politically, and I think we've talked about it a little bit. Quarter of the oil exports pass through the Strait of Hormuz and through the Gulf, right? So the way that the geopolitics of Gulf can play a role in, global decarbonization by affecting the flow of oil is quite significant, potentially. What kind of role do you think, anti-carbon politics can play in places like Iran and Iraq versus the southern coast of the Gulf, where you said that, you kind of like said quite correctly that, the labor question, the level of power, financial as well as political, that the states and national oil companies have over the carbon economy is tremendous. Whereas in the north, you have much more open political field, paradoxically. So, I just wanted you to kind of like speculate on that.
Yeah, thanks, Kaveh. That's a really interesting question. And yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that, and this is why I think it's useful to think about these geographies in different kinds of ways. In the class structures of these countries are, and this question of migrant workers and in the GCC compared to places like Iran and Iraq, where historically you've had very militant labor movements, left movements, anti-colonial revolutions, all Iran particularly with through the 50s and the 70s, and I think this is one of the reasons why this kind of US alliance with the GCC and particularly with Saudi Arabia was not just a question of its oil resources, it was also a question of its class structure, Saudi Arabia's class structure, that is functional to, if you like, American empire more globally. But yeah, it's so, I mean, I think you are right in the sense that the language of like an anti-carbon or anti-fossil fuel kind of movements and the possibilities of those kind of movements emerging in Iran and Iraq compared to the Gulf, I think you're right. Maybe that is a point of hope, if you like, in terms of thinking about how these places can play a role. Because clearly in the Gulf, there's no politics allowed beyond the kind of public official politics. And as we've said, a lot of the kind of environmentalism and the green stuff is really wrapped up in this language of greenwashing or, private sector development, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing I would say, though, is that given the very deep ways in which kind of the authoritarian states in both Iran and Iraq depend upon oil revenues, in different ways, but that I guess militates to some degree against. I mean, it's not going to be a state-led process. It's going to be something that has to come from trade unions and movements beyond the state. But Kaveh would know this much better than me in terms of like the on-the-ground kind of possibilities of that happening. But I do think it's a really good question, and maybe it's a question also that's not just in terms of the Gulf. Places like North Africa, where I think there are these similar kinds of questions, where green, in the language of green technologies, solar and hydrogen and stuff are actually in places like Morocco and Tunisia actually being used to displace people and really in quite negative ways. So possibilities then again there, I think, for perhaps environmental ecology movements to emerge.
Yeah. I'll just add, I know time is limited. I just wanted to add this, that I think one thing that is really important is that the level of ecological crisis and toxicity affecting Northern Gulf is I think incomparable to the South, with water,
Absolutely.
with pollution, with warfare. It's, so something to kind of think about. I wish I knew the answer. That's why I'm asking you.
and also the levels of, the impact of climate change as well.
Exactly.
The livability of these spaces.
Yes. Well, we could continue to talk about all of this in more detail for sure. Yeah, but I just wanted to thank everyone for your thoughtful contributions. Again, Adam, for such a compelling presentation. Gianfranco for co-organizing and co-chairing this. I don't know if you have any final remarks, Gianfranco, or anything to add.
Just want to echo your words. Thank you so much. Thank you, Adam, for fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. And thanks for all the great questions. Very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.